we go around the room, and we will let everyone introduce himself, herself, if you would, with your institutional affiliation. And then Christian Osterman will introduce our speaker this afternoon. Let's begin with the legal counsel of the American Historical Association. Let's see, we need the microphone, actually, Tim. Let's begin again with Albert Beveridge.
Hi, Albert Beveridge, Johns Hopkins University.
Carol Sang, historian of Japan and independent scholar.
Maya Freudenberg, intern at the center here.
Jay Marks, Proposition 1.
Henning Krumbach, intern at the center as well.
James Person with the History and Public Policy program here at the center.
Greg Brzezinski, George Washington University, and visiting at the center.
Kara Coughlin, I'm an intern at the center.
Mara Albrecht, I'm with a junior scholar with the History and Public Policy program.
Miriam House Cunningham, the National History Center.
Mel Leffler, I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center this year and the University of Virginia.
Seth Center, historian at the State Department.
Bill McAllister, historian at the State Department.
Carl Ashley, I work with those guys at the State Department.
Robert Townsend, American Historical Association.
Pilar City Sudhir, also at the American Historical Association.
Holly Galley with Georgetown University.
Jennifer Burns, I'm a colleague of Phillips at the History Department at the University of Virginia.
John Carlin, History Office, Department of State.
Jim Grossman, American Historical Association.
Tom Dell, former DOD.
Barbara Curli, visiting Fulbright Chair, Georgetown University, teaching history of European integration.
Brady Jewett from here at the Wilson Center.
Kate Vasonic, an intern at the center here.
John Wiley Boone, and I'm also an intern here at the Scott.
I'm Don Doyle. I'm with the University of South Carolina and also a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Jim Banner, the National History Center.
John Prados from the National Security Archive.
Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center.
Frédéric Bozois, I'm a professor at the Sorbonne and a public policy scholar this year at the Wilson Center.
Jennifer Foray, Kluge Center. I'm a Kluge Fellow for this year and normally at Purdue University.
Ken McDonald, excuse me, former historian CIA.
Chandler McDonald, Department of State.
David Nichols, historian at the State Department. Red Austin, Modern Indian History.
Susan Carruthers at Rutgers University, Newark, and a Wilson Fellow this year.
Michael Kimmage, historian at Catholic University.
Oleg Kozlowski, High School of Economics in Moscow and visiting scholar at Wilson Center.
Sam Wells here at the Wilson Center.
Bob Hathaway, also at the Wilson Center.
Ted Kiefer, historian at the Department of Defense.
Erin Mahan, the historian of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and Philip was my first boss at the Miller Center of Public Affairs.
Don Ritchie, Senate historian.
We want everyone to know how very pleased we are that Philip Zelikow can be our guest this afternoon, and Christian Osterman is going to introduce him.
Thank you, Roger. Let me also, is this on? Welcome all of you on behalf of the Wilson Center and the National History Center to this installment of the Washington History Seminar. We're very pleased to have with us today Professor Philip Zelikow. I think we're all in for a very special treat with a talk on accidents and axioms, the curious history of U.S. foreign policy. Let me, before I introduce our guest speaker, just thank, as I always like to do, a lot of work goes into preparing these meetings. Miriam House Cunningham, from the National History Center, and on my staff, Tim McDonnell and Alison Liakov, who is not in here right now. Let me thank them also for putting together the event and making sure that we have some munchies and a glass of wine to sip on afterwards for a little reception that you're all invited to. Now, on to our featured speaker. It's a great honor and privilege to introduce Professor Zelikow. He, of course, is the White Burkett Miller Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in History at the University of Virginia. He began his professional career as a lawyer in Texas, then got a PhD from Tufts University's Fletcher School, was a career diplomat posted overseas and in Washington, including, as many of you know, service on the NSC staff of President George Herbert Walker Bush. Since 1991, he has taught and directed research programs at Harvard University, the Kennedy School, I believe, and at the University of Virginia, including the Presidential Tapes project there that has been mentioned in our proceedings at times. His books include Germany Unified and Europe Transformed, co-authored with Condoleezza Rice, The Kennedy Tapes, co-edited with Ernest May, and Essence of Decision, co-authored with Graham Allison. In addition to service on a number of government advisory boards, as he modestly states, he is also an elected member of a local school board, and he has taken 2 public service leaves from academia to return full-time to government service for 2 assignments in 2003 to 2004 to direct the 9/11 Commission, and much of the Commission's report was drafted, I think, by Philip, and then, of course, in 2005 to 2007 as counselor of the State Department and as deputy to Secretary Rice. He advises the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's program in global development and is also a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. This is just a short glimpse at the distinguished career and service and accomplishments of our guest speaker, and so it's a great pleasure to welcome him to our Washington History Seminar, and feel free to add or correct anything that I've just said.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here at the National History Center and the Wilson Center, and an honor to have the chance to address such a distinguished group of colleagues. This talk is a kind of introduction to a book I'm working on. It is a history of U.S. foreign policy. The book was the inspiration of my old friend and colleague Ernest May, who started work on it before illness suddenly overtook him last year. We both thought the work was terribly important. The two of us had already co-authored an essay that tried to articulate some of these ideas that was published in a magazine. After Ernest's death, and at the request of his widow, I am completing what he began. So while I'm the only one accountable for what I choose to say here today, many ideas and even some turns of phrase are his. His name will be on the cover alongside mine. I cannot measure the debt that I owe to him. Okay, the history of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, a big subject. The writing is still a long, long way from being done, but I'll try to keep the book short by concentrating it on some key questions. This talk today really is an introduction to those questions. From the early days after independence down to the 1960s, most writing about U.S. international relations was patriotic and celebratory. Standard textbooks told how Americans proved themselves more virtuous and clever than Europeans, became masters of their continent and neighborhood, and labored to bring prosperity and education to less fortunate people. From the 1930s to the 1950s, the dominant textbook was by Samuel Flagg Bemis of Yale. A central casting Mr. Pickwick, complete with fancy waistcoats and sometimes even spats, Bemis, often on the basis of very deep research, portrayed early American political leaders as having calculatedly wrested advantage from the distress suffered by Europe during the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon and their turbulent aftermath. He portrayed their successors as, with rare excursions, wisely preserving national isolation in preparation for ultimate political and moral hegemony. A textbook by Stanford historian Thomas A. Bailey gradually displaced Bemis's. An informal California native, Bailey focused less on leading statesmen than on public opinion, particularly as manifested in newspapers and magazines. His best-known non-textbook dealt with Woodrow Wilson's failure to shape peace in 1919-1920. Bailey offered judgments, but more in the manner of a judge reviewing the cases that happened to come on the docket, as the government usually focused on issues as they figured in headlines. Bailey held Americans in general to show collective wisdom, but sometimes capable of large mistakes. Since the 1960s, a dominant narrative has been anti-patriotic, or as its authors might put it, a narrative to foster an appropriately critical and disillusioned picture of the U.S. government. They noticed a government laden with racist assumptions, a tool of elite businessmen and financiers, who created false alarms about threats from foreigners, extended their own informal empire around the globe, and callously dispatched American youth to wars in such places as the Philippines and Vietnam, protecting not only their profits, but their dominance at home. This school's forerunner was Charles A. Beard, a popular historian long known best for a 1913 monograph arguing that the framers of the Constitution were primarily motivated by greed. They had bought up supposedly worthless certificates of Revolutionary War debt, Beard contended, and wanted a new national government that would assume and pay off these obligations. Beard also wrote critically about U.S. engagement with the rest of the world, contending that it served the interests of financiers and manufacturers and enlisted patriotism to subdue movements for domestic reform. During and just after World War II, Beard published 2 books denouncing FDR and charging him with having provoked the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor in order to get the United States into a war which most ordinary Americans understood to be not in their interest. Controversy over the Vietnam War gave rise to a whole new generation of historians who borrowed Beard's basic line, though not necessarily his particular charges concerning Pearl Harbor. Their leader was William Epelman Williams, a genuinely charismatic Naval Academy graduate who had left the service, taken a doctorate in history at Wisconsin, and in 1956 published The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, the forerunner of scores of books by his disciples, all arguing in one way or another much what Beard had argued. In dealing with other nations, said this literature, the U.S. government acted chiefly on behalf of or at the behest of a financial and commercial elite. Alleged threats from abroad were invented, or at least exaggerated, in order to rationalize use of national resources to maintain a defense establishment, and to intervene abroad to protect American holdings jeopardized by nationalist or socialist movements in other countries. Acknowledging that the United States had not built a territorial empire comparable to those of other countries, Williams and his followers used the term, quote, open-door imperialism, close quote, as a shorthand for the purpose underlying American actions in the world. Time lags in academia being what they are, the graduate students of the 1970s, inspired by Williams and influenced by the Vietnam War, became the professors who taught graduate students in the 1980s and 1990s. Those graduate students, in turn, became the senior professors of today. Hence, writing and teaching by professional historians has tended, until fairly recently, to suppose purposeful open-door imperialism. Many historians of American foreign policy, seeking a middle ground between judging America positively or negatively, chose a different tack. They instead measured the country by how well it had pursued its true national interests. Thus, they rejected the overweening enthusiasm of evangelical patriots, while also decrying politicians who seemed to pursue only particular special interests. These historians considered themselves to be realists. This school, too, had its origin principally in the 1950s, which was a busy and formative decade for historians of American foreign policy. The doers and the writers all shared the sense that they had just come through a global war of unprecedented scale. It seemed to them that they had participated in a great national trial and triumph. They were figuring out what their country wanted to be as it grew up. The stakes seemed enormous. This was a period of novel ideas, ardent proposals, and loud national debates, with few, if any, settled traditions remaining as guides. It is not that the Americans were unworldly. The subject of international relations has been familiar to Americans for centuries, whether as leaders or just as attentive citizens. New were the opportunities for influence and the scale of the responsibilities. Just after the June 1950 North Korean attack on South Korea, President Harry Truman hunted for some analogy to explain the shock he felt. He remembered what had seemed to him a terrific jolt a few years earlier, in February 1947, when the British had asked the Americans to take on responsibility for securing the future of the Eastern Mediterranean. Jotting a note to his wife, the day after the North Korean attack, Truman said he hadn't been, quote, so badly upset since Greece and Turkey fell into our lap, close quote. Notice the way he phrases that. And on top of all these responsibilities, there was another dreadful novelty, the sense of encroaching apocalyptic danger that came with the new age of atomic bombs. In April of 1951, George Kennan arrived in Chicago to deliver the first in a series of lectures about American diplomacy. A balding man, 47, conservative and ascetic in appearance, a shy, sensitive loner in his personal life, Kennan was decompressing on extended leave from 25 years of duty in the Foreign Service of the United States. For most of these years, Kennan had served overseas, fluent in Russian and German, becoming renowned among insiders as one of the deepest thinkers and most lucid writers in the diplomatic corps. The press had recently discovered him. When the venerated retired Army leader, George Marshall, became Secretary of State in 1947, Marshall created a new office at State, a policy planning staff, and Kennan was the man Marshall had picked out to head this staff. For more than 3 extraordinary years in U.S. history, Kennan had held first this job and then a similar post as counselor of the department. Later generations would regard this as the period when the U.S. developed an exceptionally clear-cut grand strategy, usually communicated in a word: containment. Kennan was a prime eyewitness. Yet what now seems so clear to us was, to Kennan, at the time, anything but. He confided to his diary in August 1950, weeks after the United States went to war in Korea, that, quote, never before has there been such utter confusion in the public mind with respect to U.S. foreign policy. The President doesn't understand it. Congress doesn't understand it. Nor does the public, nor does the press. They all wander around, Kennan wrote, in a labyrinth of ignorance and error and conjecture, in which truth is intermingled with fiction at 100 points, in which unjustified assumptions have attained the validity of premises, and in which there is no recognized and authoritative theory to hold on to, close quote. In 1951, Kennan delivered a beautifully written series of lectures to offer just such an authoritative theory. He offered the lodestar of national interest, which he thought could be discerned clearly once passions, illusions, and narrow interests could be put aside. The problem, he thought, was that the United States did not have, quote, any general agreement, both within and without our government, on the basic concepts underlying the conduct of the external relations of the United States, close quote. In a memorable passage in those 1951 Chicago lectures, Kennan likened a democracy to, quote, one of those prehistoric monsters with a body as long as this room and a brain the size of a pin. He lies there in his comfortable primeval mud and pays little attention to his environment. He is slow to wrath. In fact, you practically have to whack his tail off to make him aware that his interests are disturbed. But once he grasps this, He lays about him with such blind determination that he not only destroys his adversary, but largely wrecks his native habitat." Close quote. Kennan's metaphor is extravagant, but it vividly conveys his doubts about whether the American democracy, or perhaps any democracy, would turn over the job of defining its interests to suitably wise and disillusioned Bismarckian guides. Kennan was not alone in his unease. Hans Morgenthau, a German refugee from Nazism, was teaching at Chicago when Kennan gave his lectures there. Morgenthau had concluded that, quote, "what passed for foreign policy," close quote, in the United States was no more than, quote, "either improvisation or, especially in our century, the invocation of some moral principle in whose image the world was to be made over," close quote. Kennan and Morgenthau were making a political argument. It was an argument fueled by the experience of an era of global war that the contest of mighty and terrible powers required the guidance of wise pilots, viewing the terrain from a great height, detached from sentiment about how other peoples manage their own affairs. This kind of political argument was then employed on the side of one or another policy in the continuing debates about how to wage a long Cold War. Kennan and Morgenthau powerfully influenced what has since become a deeply ingrained habit, now generations old, of characterizing American foreign policies or thinkers as realist or idealist. The usage is especially common in the United States and to a lesser degree in Great Britain. Another key figure was the religious thinker, Reinhold Niebuhr, who argued the moral necessity for confronting domineering doctrines like Nazism or communism with power, yet warned of power's vices and its limits. America had to put aside its sense of wounded innocence, accept the moral burden of wielding inherently sinful power, and confront the nasty world. The rise of realist thinking was mirrored in the work of prolific diplomatic historians of the 1960s and 1970s, such as Norman Graebner, a lanky Army veteran who became an able scholar and a gifted lecturer. Graebner regularly held his huge classes of students at Illinois, then Virginia, spellbound with his stories of wisdom and unwisdom. Kennan, Morgenthau, and Graebner all opposed the escalation of the war in Vietnam during the 1960s. Contrasts of realism and idealism enjoyed a powerful revival during the arguments that occurred around the 2002-2003 Iraq war decisions. The realism-idealism argument had great appeal among American thinkers during the 1950s and has resonated from time to time in later controversies too. So facing this argument, those cast in the role of idealists have usually played defense. What scholar wants to be identified as unrealistic? Surreal, perhaps, but unreal, no. Hence the spectacle of cornered historians writing essays earnestly insisting that it might turn out to be wise to adhere to certain principles in international relations, or they would attach conciliatory titles in an article here on, quote, "the realism of idealism," close quote, or a book there, like one from Woodrow Wilson's biographer, extolling his man's, quote, "higher realism," close quote. Very recently, neoconservative historians have played another kind of defense, starting to tell a story which resembles that of the anti-patriots, but turns it on its head. Going along with the cherry-picking of evidence in the style of the old New Left to show that the United States is aggressively self-serving, the neoconservatives say this has benefited the rest of the world by pushing it toward American ideals. This particular style of argument, realism versus idealism, has played so well for so long because it works in recurrent political debates. Yet I think there is a deeper reason this kind of argument has been so popular and durable. I think this style of argument actually appeals to very deeply rooted habits of thought and temperament. More than 100 years ago, the philosopher and pioneer student of psychology, William James, described a similar divide in arguments about philosophy and religion. What we might now call realism versus idealism, he described as an argument between the, quote, empiricist and the rationalist. The empiricist sought his guide in facts, quote, in all their crude variety, close quote. The rationalist was a man of principle, quote, abstract and eternal principles, close quote. James noted, of course, that no one can live an hour without both facts and principles. So it is a difference, rather, of emphasis, close quote. So the interesting point for him was that these mere gradations of temperament could breed, quote, antipathies of the most pungent character between those who lay the emphasis differently, close quote. Indeed, this sort of antagonism, James explained in a Harvard lecture, quote, has formed in all ages a part of the philosophic atmosphere of the time. The tough think of the tender as sentimentalists and softheads. The tender feel the tough to be unrefined, callous, or brutal, close quote. Fortunately, James reassured, quote, few of us are tenderfoot Bostonians, pure and simple, and few are typical Rocky Mountain toughs in philosophy. Most of us have a hankering for the good things on both sides of the line, close quote. Among those who have a hankering for the good things on both sides of the line are practically all the men and women who have actually held high policy-making posts in the United States government. The three schools, patriotic, anti-patriot, critical patriot, realist, idealist, each call attention to characteristic motives. Look among the numberless figures from America's past, and you will surely find some with a vision of American greatness. Others, a businessman's gimlet eye on the main chance, and still more, offering the skeptic's counsel of calculation and restraint. But putting the spotlight on one or another of these motives does not offer enough historical explanation. All three schools yield readily to the temptation of enrobing the historian as a judge, rendering verdicts. Quote, world history is the world's court of justice, close quote, was the motto of Schiller, using a German word, Weltgericht, that also carried with it a religious notion of final judgment. Historians are usually ill-suited for the role of judges, especially hanging ones. Their judgments, like much of the literature on the origins of the Cold War, as Geir Lundestad reminded us about 20 years ago, those judgments are, and were often meant to be, arguments in a great ongoing political debate. One irony was that the Americans often tended to place themselves at the center of the story, as the defendant on trial, exaggerating their importance, whether for purposes of praise or for self-flagellation. Like most people, historians are also poor judges because they are so prey to the post hoc fallacy of judging the choice by its consequences, whether these were or even could have been foreseen. Even if they reconstruct what was actually known in that distant moment, they must also attend to the particular beliefs that colored past presumptions. They also may not have marinated long enough in the related technical issues or bureaucratic cultures. Even among the best historians, those sensitive to the context of place and beliefs, the specific action choices available under the circumstances are often especially difficult to reconstruct. Now, many academic historians long ago put aside the role of judge in fields aside from U.S. foreign policy. So among those academic historians in those other fields, you'll find the cry of one, Robespierre's anti-Robespierre's, contemplating the warring histories of the French Revolution. For pity's sake, simply tell us what Robespierre was, close quote. It's, as Marc Bloch put it about 70 years ago. The schools of interpretation have another flaw. They attach common labels to what are actually very different worldviews. John Quincy Adams becomes classified with Henry Kissinger as kindred, quote, realists, close quote. George W. Bush is grouped with Woodrow Wilson as fellow, quote, idealists. These classificatory schemes work very well in lectures to undergraduates. But the supposed commonalities in thought break down on closer scrutiny. I am uneasy with this spectral dance of bloodless categories across time, to borrow a phrase used by Bill Langer, who attributed it to Bill James. Another problem these three schools of thinking about American foreign relations have in common is the supposition that American leaders actually devised and pursued grand strategies with consistent themes over time. My own view is at odds with all three schools, for I believe that the U.S. government has usually acted in international affairs because it has had to do so, not because it chose to act. Where these actions then cohere over time, it is more into a set of widely held and rather specific axioms, reinforced by the institutions that grow up around them, than by acts of collective will. My unease with the three schools of writing about the history of U.S. foreign policy is compounded when the great choices and grand strategies are explained by theories that either explain too much or too little. For instance, one mutation of the realist thinking is a theory of international relations called neorealism that sees the structures of international power as explaining most, if not all, significant behavior. On the other hand, flying from that scarecrow, other historians have instead recently emphasized domestic politics and the political, cultural, and economic profit from inflating enemy threats as explaining the course of the Cold War. Neither theory meaningfully accounts for large stretches of American history or provides much insight into choices made in the most dire crises. They are too much. Another interesting recent work of history looks at the strange time before the 1898 war against Spain and notices the turmoil of gender relations in a fast-changing society. The author observes frequent voicing of patriarchal instincts to look after feminized little countries while lustily invoking the duties of manhood, and finds in these impulses the origins of the war with Spain to liberate Cuba. There is something to this argument. It does plausibly trace another tributary flowing into the distempered currents of 1890s American politics, the whirlpools and tempests so important to the puzzle of explaining that war. But other factors were more decisive in forcing the hand of William McKinley, a capable president long determined to avoid war. Absent those other factors, which range from the peculiar dilemmas of Spanish politics to the mysterious destruction of a U.S. warship in Havana Harbor, there might have been no war. The gender factors would still have been in the background either way. They would thus have been a conditioned precedent to war or to peace. This kind of explanation does too little. For the most part, this academic teaching and writing in the various schools we describe has not been influenced by actual experience in the government. The graduate students of the 1970s were too young to have seen military service in World War II or the Korean War, and were protected from the Vietnam War by student deferments. On university campuses, demonstrations were almost as much anti-government as anti-war. Recruiters, even from the Foreign Service, often found themselves turned away, which has been a shame in many ways. Among them, a somewhat distorted understanding of the nature of foreign policy in general, and U.S. foreign policy in particular. To say this is not to say that action by the U.S. government should be understood as entirely reactive, or to reject entirely arguments like that of open-door imperialism. But someone who has actually seen the inner workings of the U.S. government is less likely to feel sure that its actions are best understood by hypothesizing collective purposefulness. The U.S. government has some very distinctive features. In combination, they make it very hard for U.S. actions to have lasting coherence, consistency, or predictability. The principal features are the fragmentation of power and the porousness of the processes for wielding it. I could go on at some length on the way in which power is separated, divided, and cut up in a variety of different ways, some formal and some informal. But since you're all here in Washington, D.C., you probably feel deeply familiar with this already. What I will observe is that the major effect of outside opinion is actually rather subtle as it seeps into the culture of beliefs and methods of operation within the policymaking community itself, because that community is so very much a part of that society. The great debates are actually visible on a mass scale, as are the axioms that flow into and out of those debates. They are part of the air all breathe, inside and outside the government. The porous nature of the government, with the attendant role for outside influence, the news media, and public opinion, makes really large, sustainable policies rare, hard to create. The porousness reinforces the strong inherent tendency toward entropy, to fragmentation of policies, hearing many voices, pulled this way and that, switching channels. But in the rare case that a set of beliefs becomes entrenched, the same features can make those beliefs remarkably stable. Once certain habits of thought and expression are firmly in place, public opinion turns out to be a hard ship to turn. Responsive to that opinion, well aware of the phrases and references that cue to those established beliefs, to the reigning axioms about their country and the world, then the news media, the politicians, and the officials all will be inclined to steer with the current. So having argued that United States foreign policy has historically been exceptional because of the character of this fragmented and relatively open republic, let me examine the more commonplace argument of American exceptionalism. That's the argument that would have us place greatest emphasis on the restless ideals long associated with the founders, builders, and successive leaders of this particular nation, creating a republic dedicated to freedom and fashioned for a new world. Some very good work has already been done from such a premise, usually with a caution against the vices of becoming a, quote, crusader state, close quote. John Winthrop's appeal in 1630 to the Puritan settlers, quote, to be as a city upon a hill, close quote, has echoed down the centuries. John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan quoted the phrase in speeches, and the underlying message has threaded the oratory of other presidents, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So, what about the city on the hill and all that? Isn't American foreign policy distinctively self-centered and moralistic? Doesn't American ideology make more difference than all these institutional wrinkles I've just stressed? The answer is both no and yes. No, because one can find equally strong egotism and moralism elsewhere. Just think of the British government when William Ewart Gladstone was Britain's prime minister in the 1870s and 1880s, or French leaders boasting of their mission civilisatrice, or the pretenses of the Soviet Union under Lenin and Trotsky, or China under Mao, or even China today under Hu Jintao, reviving the study of Confucian virtue and extolling the special quality of its public management. Any community will speak loudly of its special virtues, especially if it is feeling good about itself, or pretending to. Yes, however, because the peculiarities of American government give these proclivities more space for expression than is or has been the case in most other nations. Religious belief is pervasive, less in the form of some specific interest group and more as part of common culture. Churches and their congregations necessarily figure prominently in the mental maps of members of the House of Representatives. From earliest days, ministers, priests, rabbis, and lay leaders in religious bodies have had large influence among voters in their communities. Time and again, something happening in the outside world has led churchgoers to call for action by the government. The groundswell in 1898 for armed intervention in Cuba was strongest among Protestants in Middle America, people who tended to worry about Catholic influences and disliked what they knew of Catholic Spain. Politicians and officials, of course, have ideals too. Some particular principle of the public good reigns in practically every country's officialdom. It is not so much that they are realists, as it is that their ideals, their guiding principles, are so strongly influenced by their particular portfolio of responsibilities the matters they must attend to and must juggle every day. The United States is distinctive in its long tradition of moralistic discourse about foreign affairs, but it is even more distinctive because split sovereignty and the consequent strength of the news media, lobbies, and the rest allow greater play for this kind of moral argument than may be true at most times and in most other governments. The government more strongly reflects the views of the surrounding society. This feature of U.S. foreign policy, not its penetration by peculiar American ideology, but the extraordinary susceptibility of its policy judgments to influence from temporarily energized elements of the public, is one key reason why U.S. government action is most concerted, most functional, and most effective on those rare occasions when it is animated by long-term, large policies, what I think of as capital P policies, policies with a capital P, that command wide understanding and support, not just in the Wilson Center or in a sit room at the White House, but in a meeting of the Rotary Club in Cedar Rapids. It is also a key reason why such historic U.S. policies have been consciously self-serving, but at the same time defensible as also for the benefit of humankind. For sustained public support, these big P policies had to satisfy both the little devils and little angels that cartoonists show hovering over humans' heads. There have not been many such policies in American history. Less than 10 by the tally of Ernest and me, and never more than about 2 or 3 of them have been in flower at any given time. In all instances, lasting U.S. foreign policies, both of us think, also came into being in about the same way. In stage 1, there is some kind of event, noticed, or a shock that's felt by a large part of the population. Usually this was reactive, not always, but usually. Usually it was reactive to situations and ideas created by foreigners or by circumstances that were not foreseen. People in the government and people paying attention outside of government perceived the situation and then after debate came to some widely recognized definition of an international challenge that called for a long-term national response. Debate over a definition of the challenge. Stage 2 saw a different kind of debate on the content and narrative of the national response. The extended, sometimes ferocious, debate featured competition among alternative appreciations of the situation and ideas for action. A large policy began to crystallize as consensus emerged regarding, on the one hand, calculations of shared interests at stake, and on the other hand, the agreed-upon axioms that seemed applicable. There was rarely any durable consensus about what to do. Just to give one very quick illustration of this is the very famous capital P policy that goes by the phrase, no entangling alliances. That policy is generally attributed to have originated with the farewell address of George Washington, delivered in September 1796. In fact, it did not originate in Washington's farewell address. And therein lies the tale. America had been shocked and deeply divided by the French Revolution and the subsequent wars that broke out between Britain and its allies and France and its allies that convulsed American politics certainly from 1792 forward for the remainder of that decade. Incidentally, it's very important to note that these debates were not rarefied debates among a handful of elites. These were debates understood and participated in by very large swaths of the American people. Why? Because they weren't debates about foreign affairs. They were debates about America. They were debates about domestic affairs. You see, they thought the great causes that were at issue in the wars over France were actually their causes at home. That's why in American domestic politics of the 1790s, the common epithet against your political opponent was to call them a Jacobin, or to hurl the word at them that they were an Angloman, or a monocrat, or, of course, that supreme epithet from a Federalist to call someone a Democrat, then still a term of abuse. See, that vocabulary, those ideas that were at issue in the Great War in Europe were ideas that were at issue caught up in the whole way in which Americans were defining their republic. So those debates go on all through the decade. Washington gives his farewell address. Some argue, actually, in a fairly politicized context in which Hamilton's influence is given great weight. I give Washington a little more credit than that. What's important to note is that Washington's pronouncement by no means ended the debate. The debate actually escalates after Washington's pronouncement and reaches its height in the late 1790s. The debate comes to a crystallization around the Big P policy, especially during a period between about 1799 and 1801, critically involving, above all, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Washington, in fact, has just passed away, and he's already having his apotheosis. Adams breaks the Federalist Party in half in 1799 over some of these issues. His reasons for doing so are only partly having to do with foreign affairs and significantly both domestic and personal. Jefferson, when he is elected in the election of 1800 and takes office, chooses in his March 1801 inaugural to say, we are all united around the axiom of the great deceased Washington. The words he had uttered 4.5 years earlier, which Jefferson then invoked in his first inaugural to claim, we all unite, of course, under that banner. And then by the 1820s, when historians began writing this up, they began attributing the raising of the banner to Washington himself, and the change to Washington instead of the construction between Adams and Jefferson, as they were choosing to crystallize a centrist consensus, in part because of the problems with Britain, but also in very significant part because of radically growing disillusionment with France, and a significant change in the views within the Republican Party about both France and about Bonaparte personally that occurred especially in those first years of the consulate. Then after the axiom passed into practice and then was solidified by action, above all the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the no entangling alliances, the concentration on American expansion, has almost this divine emanation of Washington's immortal pronouncement that we should follow, when in fact it was the path of domestic political safety for both Jefferson and Adams in some highly idiosyncratic moments. Faith is made real by works, in the case of the Louisiana Purchase, which very much codified a new continentalist vision to try to escape from a conflict in Europe in which they no longer wished to take sides, though many of them had wished to take sides all through the 1790s. And then historians enshrined this as a belief that all Americans should adhere to because it had come from the Founding Fathers. The first histories begin writing this up in the 1820s, looking back on this generation of divine inspiration. And indeed, you'll find then on the mastheads of newspapers in the early 20th century, the words "no entangling alliances," quote unquote, George Washington, literally printed on the masthead of the daily paper, even though, by the way, that particular phrase was not Washington's at all, it was Jefferson's. Washington had said no permanent alliances, which was a different idea. As the axiom solidifies, of course, it becomes very difficult to dislodge. The basic conception of the challenge and the broad notions of interests at stake and axiomatic beliefs, once fully adopted, become iconic. This was stage 3. Debates about actions continued, but inside the new framework. You could still have lots of arguments as long as we all agree, of course, there's no entangling alliances. That goes beyond party. All parties agree on that. All factions in the Congress agree on that. Federal, state, local governments. As for the defined interests and axioms, it became sacrilege to question their inspired quality. The belief that the United States ought to have no entangling alliances lasted more than 140 years. Once canonized, veneration of a, quote, Monroe Doctrine for the Western Hemisphere lasted almost as long. There were extraordinary travails involved in gradually acknowledging that either of these hallowed doctrines had become obsolete. But the original policies, as I've tried to very briefly suggest, had an intricate history of their own. Broad macro public debates, as much or more a matter of culture and society than of high politics, are part of the early stages. Yet then intricate micro stories, very much in high politics, help explain the crystallization of certain beliefs through their translation into highly visible deeds, this kind of demonstration of faith through works. These beliefs, these axioms, later seemed self-evidently right. How ironic it would be that Kennan, who in 1950 found no coherent foreign policy at all, would find generations of students learning that in fact the policy had been perfectly clear because he himself, Kennan, had formulated it to America 3 years earlier. But that self-evident rightness actually occurs only after strenuous argument had winnowed out many of the alternatives available at the time. And the successful policies became lodestars only after they had won wide support across the branches of government, across party and factional lines, across regions, faiths, and interest groups. They then evolved, at least stylistically, with changes in conditions, people, and processes. Such policies were quite durable. They became focal points in society, the seeds from which new institutions would grow, structures that then spawned their own networks of supporters and dependents. Again, we are back in the realm of social and cultural history. Looking backward, it sometimes seems to me that the axioms could persist well past the point at which they seemed functionally and effectively related to actual conditions in the world. Sometimes only a fresh shock could displace the older habits. The fourth and final stage, for a big P policy no longer alive, was a painful process of reorientation. It has been hard to abandon a long-lived consensus about national interests. It has been harder still to relinquish long-held beliefs about regularities in the conduct of other nations or our own. What interests me as a historian is not only the content of these policies, the what of them, but also the whys, including the character of the social processes that flow into their creation and then revolve around them. The surrounding circumstances are vital, but then there are those accidents of history. Writing nearly 150 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville speculated about the course of the February 1848 overthrow of France's monarchy. De Tocqueville had been an important figure in the tumult. He later tried to unpack this extraordinary experience and explain it. This is the same passage that has the famous line about, the theorist imagines it's all about great causes, and the statesman imagines that he's done it all himself, and it is to be presumed that both are equally deceived. You've probably heard that line. Let me give you some other lines, though, from the same passage. He explained that the Revolution of 1848 was like other great events, in that it, quote, sprang from general causes, impregnated, if I am permitted the expression, by accidents, close quote. De Tocqueville scorned big generic causal arguments that emanated, he said, from, quote, writers who have invented these sublime theories in order to feed their vanity and facilitate their work, close quote. We wouldn't know any of those. He was extremely, de Tocqueville, interested in these accidents. And he explained that they were not really accidents at all. Chance, he added, was really, quote, that tangle of secondary causes which we call chance, for want of the knowledge how to unravel it, close quote. That prolific William James comes to our aid here too, as he also found himself drawn to this problem of accident and chance in human affairs. He mused about the way people experienced and then interpreted these surprises. Quote, do not all the motives that assail us, all the futures that offer themselves to our choice, spring equally from the soil of the past? And would not either one of them, whether realized through chance or through necessity, the moment it was realized, seem to us to fit that past? close quote. Chance, accident, shock was something people did feel and experience. But such words applied to human choices could also be a sort of escape, obscuring a deep and tangled story. They were words that, as James put it, quote, tell us nothing about what chances, or to animate the thoughts and actions of a divided and cacophonous country. One true distiller of Americana was that white-haired New Englander, the poet Robert Frost. Near the end of his long life, Frost was going to Soviet Russia. It was the summer of 1962, the very height of the Cold War. Frost was going to see the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Asked by a friend what he would say to Khrushchev, Frost replied, I'm going to tell him America has a ramshackle government. The harder you ram it, the firmer it shackles. Close quote. Thank you.
Philip, may I open the discussion by taking you up just on a point of explanation? You mentioned that this is a joint authorship, as much Ernest May as yourself. You were talking about Bemis and Bradley, Beard, William Appleman Williams. Could you take just a step back and explain to us how you think that Ernest May will be remembered in this vein, his enduring work?
Yeah, I can try. In part, I think he undertook this project after teaching American foreign relations history at Harvard for 50 years because he felt he had not written an adequate synthesis that could readily answer your question.
I quite agree.
So because what he intended to do very early on, he was drawn very early to these issues of axioms and beliefs. He wrote a really quite remarkable essay in 1962 called U.S. Foreign Policy, the Calculated and the Axiomatic. And in that 1962 essay, he actually spends quite a lot of time on the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. And so he comes to this belief that people are animated by these beliefs. So then that led him into a set of thinking, where do the beliefs come from? He concluded that the beliefs come above all actually from the way people interpret history, which then led him to be extremely interested in analogies, the use of analogies, and how public officials use history in forming these presumptions in their heads, these axioms. So that then leads him to books like Lessons of the Past on Vietnam, the book he did with Dick Neustadt on Thinking in Time. And that remains a preoccupation of his, because then after he got deeper and deeper into the analogies, he was also then very interested in kind of where do these historical stories come from. And he was also pursuing at the same time a couple of parallel agendas having to do with trying to complicate American foreign policy by introducing international history to it. His first two major works that were standards in their field were first on how America got into the First World War and second on America in 1898, Imperial Democracy. Both of them were, at the time, striking for how much they were international histories, multi-archival stories. Imperial Democracy is in very large part a history of how Europe reacted to the arrival of America as a great power. It's very interesting, though, when Ernest returned to the 1898 period in a later work he wrote in the early 1980s, and then called American Imperialism, a Speculative Essay, he didn't really try to revisit the issue of kind of here's the history of 1898. Instead, the book is really all about American public opinion. See, he's trying to get at the social processes. See, the puzzle for him in American imperialism was, okay, there are several major spikes in which people want America to expand. There's one in the Grant administration. That's a couple later on in the 1880s and 1890s. There's Spain, and then after Spain, there are proposals to take the Dominican Republic, which we turn down. We turn them down, we turn them down, we turn them down, then we expand, then we start turning them down again. And he, rather than viewing this as Samuel Flagg Bemis did, as a, quote, simply a great aberration, to borrow Bemis's phrase, his quest led him to, to look at American public opinion about all this. And actually he found that American public opinion on all this is extremely interesting. And then he was, what is the relation between public opinion and elite opinion, which he found was intimate, and then where does the public opinion come from? And one of the things he noticed is that in general, the public opinion, like the elite opinion, tends to take their cues from a variety of opinion leaders. By the way, many of them British. Many of them in the British Liberal Party, the Gladstone wing, in the late 1800s. Americans much more strongly identified with Gladstone's version of British politics than Disraelis. They tended not to think of themselves as Tories outside of maybe a few precincts of New York and San Francisco. And they then identify a lot with British liberal thought. When you see British liberal thought dividing into its liberal imperialist wings and then anti-imperialist wings increasingly, that division of thought begins to replicate itself quite a lot in American elites. But the American public opinion is still mostly not even activated. What activates it in the late 1890s is when the elites themselves divide up and argue over what they should do. Once elite opinion becomes fractured and divided, the public feels invited into the argument and a national debate occurs. And interesting, the national debate itself lasts only a couple of years before the elite actually joins up again, because by the election of 1900, even the Republicans had decided to forswear any further imperial expansion by the United States. They wrote that into the Republican Party platform in the 1900 election because they were worried that they would get the Democrats were going to beat them over the head with this, and it was a losing issue for the Republicans at home. And so they put a promise that we're not going to do this anymore into the 1900 platform to basically try to get it out of domestic politics. And the issue substantially subsides in domestic politics because no one's really arguing for any significant additional expansions. And then the nature of the debate significantly move on. So you see in all earnest preoccupation with all of this is trying to get at these issues of how do I link these social and cultural processes to the world of high politics, to the world of international politics, where much of what's happening to the Americans is their reaction to things that are happening in other capitals. And that's the synthesis that I'm trying to work through in completing the design that he had been roughing out for this book that was going to try to synthesize some of these ideas in this particular way.
David?
One idea.
Hold on.
Reintroduce yourself, please.
David Nichols at the State Department History Office. One idea which I think has had influence on both parties recently, I wanted to get your take on, is the idea of the democratic peace, which interestingly I think came from political science and is able to attract people who think of themselves as idealist as well as people who think of themselves as realist, and I think has influenced both parties. Could you speak a little bit about how that might fit into this, your idea?
The democratic peace beliefs are, in fact, a very good example of an axiomatic belief. By the way, to call something an axiomatic belief is not necessarily a pejorative comment saying it's untrue. I mean, you think about your daily lives. You rely a lot on axiomatic beliefs in your daily lives because you tend to rely often on beliefs that you found are often true. One of the dangers that has always impressed me and impressed Ernest as well, though, is, Ernest for a while basically sought to caution people about the use of analogies. His private view, which he actually published very late in his career, is he despaired. He believes that analogies are so seductive and so vicious that they can never be used. And then people say, well, then how will I use history anymore? And he'd clap his hand. He might chuckle. And then, well, it would be good to learn the history of the issue you're working on. Or let's say the background of the institution you're trying to control, its history. Or the history of the people that you think are most important at the moment, their histories. There's history everywhere, but analogies from some prior case. Basically, it's a way of using shorthand to close down analysis of the case at hand. I don't need to analyze the case at hand because it's like some other case that I already did the analysis about, or someone did it for me and I believed it. So the democratic peace theory is very much of this kind. It's this very strong axiomatic belief. Of course, democratic peace theory long antedates the political scientists' work on it. Right? It goes back to Immanuel Kant. You can find plenty of it in Woodrow Wilson, what's happened is then people have accumulated large volumes of quantitative data to try to make it as close to a law-like generalization. It does not succeed as a law-like generalization, as a number of other political scientists, I think, have effectively pointed out. And also, there are a lot of problems with it within the world of political science that I have sometimes inhabited in its effort to claim that as a law-like generalization. So suffice it to say that I regard it as a very strong axiomatic belief. The belief in democratic peace, then, that particular axiom, plays an important part in certain political arguments in trying to then say, well, it might tend to be good to use American power in a certain way because if we can support democracy, that's bound to lead to peace, as we know. I don't think this particular axiom has taken hold yet as a really cardinal principle of a capital P policy, but it's been deployed in some contender policies that are trying to ascend to that kind of bipartisan durability and permanence, but I don't think has made it yet.
Yep, Don.
Don Doyle from the University of South Carolina. I really enjoyed your talk and learned a lot from it. I wanted to just comment on one, if I understood you, one point that you were describing as axiomatic in American thinking, and that is this idea of American exceptionalism, the city upon a hill. And instead argue that it seems to me that this becomes axiomatic in the 1950s and has earlier renditions in Marxist discourse. But we've read that idea of American exceptionalism back, indeed, to its taproot in John Winthrop's sermon. But that it wasn't at all what Winthrop and what others in the 19th century were arguing. Instead, it seems to me the main strain was much more universalistic. If you read the sermon, or if one reads the sermon, it's actually a rebuke, a warning, as much as it is a boast, that we shall be a city upon a hill. All eyes are upon us. And if we deal falsely with our God, yada, yada, but it's a warning. And, of course, the Jeremiahs in New England pick up on this and say that we will disgrace God's plan. In the 19th century, too, I think the more secular version of this comes out in the idea of the model republic. But it's often based on an idea not that America is exceptional or different, but just the opposite, that our values are universal values, that everyone can live this Republican free life. And again, it's often used as a rebuke by reformers that the slave power is taking over the republic, that we are corrupt, and that we must live up to these ideals that we have professed. This is the place to do it. And so I think there's a lot more angst. It's a conceit, perhaps, that America is the foremost exemplar of republicanism or of capitalism or whatever it might be, but it's a different kind of conceit from saying that we're different. It's Kennan that incorporates that. Isn't he the one that says we have nothing to teach the world? I think that Americans in the 19th century thought they had an awful lot to teach the world if they would only get their act together, live up to their ideals.
I think the answer is yes, and all of the above. Many people have used it. For example, the critical patriots that I mentioned, William Appleman Williams, I think, regarded himself as a patriotic American who was trying to call the country and remind them of its higher ideals. In fact, you see in a lot of that literature kind of a nostalgia for the kind of America that they thought Thomas Jefferson had really envisioned, perhaps. I'm not actually trying to take sides and say there is an authoritative interpretation of American exceptionalism. I'm simply saying that these sorts of appeals are not at all unique to the United States, A, and B, this style of appeal, which has a lot of resonance in the United States, especially because of this New World aspect that is a little distinctive to us, just is a little more pervasive because a lot of the different people who are making one or another form of this argument have readier access at any given moment to the councils of government.
Other comments? Yes.
Tom Dell, I'm currently doing intelligence analysis right here for the federal government. Have you seen any examples, or did any come to mind, where 2 or 3 axioms have come up in administration's issues and clashed at the same time? And can you give any examples of that and how those are resolved? Is there a danger in that for an administration?
Yes, it can happen. Let me, though, rather than try to pull out an illustration in contemporary history, let me call attention to a really large illustration from the history of the United States in the 19th century. One of, I think, a really durable big P policies of the 19th century is the notion of an empire for liberty. It was actually a really important, powerful set of ideas about how America would expand, and had a lot of practical significance. And there were a lot of axioms that went with that about how territories would be created, how they would apply for statehood, and a lot of other things. And it also, you see, was very much caught up in the notion of the kind of republic we had, and it was a republic that by expanding in this way and not in other ways. All right, so very powerful set of axioms underneath that. What comes to contend with it, beginning in the 1820s, but really intensifying in a great national debate in the 1840s, is the notion of an empire for slavery. Is empire for slavery just another version of the empire for liberty, the liberty to hold slaves? Or is the empire for liberty to hold slaves actually an argument in favor of an empire for slavery that is fundamentally at odds with the vision of an empire for liberty? That actually is an issue the government does not resolve, and ultimately will split the country and cause a civil war. Because in fact, the Southerners' argument, even to the point of secession, was the preservation of their liberty to hold slaves wherever they wanted to go.
Thank you. Yeah.
Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Speaking of empires, you're probably familiar with Geir Lundestad's book, Empire by Integration.
Invitation.
Well,
and the book, the sequel. Yes.
Yes, the book is Empire by Integration. The first formula he used was Empire by Invitation. Right. Now, and that's, of course, a perception of the United States by others, and it is widespread. And a lot of Europeans wished the United States would be that way. And somehow this perception, well, how shall I put it, got lost, changed under the impact of Iraq in particular. Can you help to trace back in reality what happened? Was our perception wrong of the empire by integration? Or is there something changing in the United States behavior that makes it more difficult to be this empire by integration? And it goes back to an old school, of course, of thought. Empires usually ran their empires from the center, right? The United States were the first country that ran an empire by letting the periphery evolve and thrive, right? Do you see a change in reality here? I mean, I would like to see the United States, you know, to remain the empire of integration and do what empires do, or the United States model, you know, to help others to thrive, right? And be part of the story, but not try to impose, you know, like traditional empires do. Can you comment on that, please?
I can, and I'm glad for the question, Dieter, because I really want to, I'm going to really try to buck the current on the use of this term empire. This term, to me, is another term like realist. That has joined the spectral dance of bloodless categories across time. That leaves me so uneasy. When Jefferson used the term empire, it was actually a casual noun that had actually a relatively positive of just kind of any expansive domain. it didn't have the kind of baggage that we now associate with this term. There's actually a very nice book that does the etymology of the words empire and imperialism at whole book length. When we use the term empire now, it actually carries a ton of baggage with it as we're analogizing it to, say, the British Empire, for example, to some territorial empire, and then we have to explain, no, it's an informal empire, or it's open-door imperialism. I find that these are the kinds of words that end up actually obscuring more than they reveal when you use them, because they're not technically descriptive. They're actually shortcuts that are designed to provide us with a ready classifying scheme that avoids thought. Because the Americans themselves who've been running the country did not think they were running an empire. Now, of course, they might have been deceiving themselves or hypocritical about it, but I'll just urge you, it's whenever people don't know that they're doing what you say they're doing, this is a caution. They may nonetheless be doing it, and you may be right, but if they don't think they're doing it and they don't use those words, then it's possible that their mental maps are not the same as yours in some material way. So Americans don't actually think they're running an empire, and that point matters. And actually, they're not training in imperial civil service. They're not training, they're not developing the administrative apparatus to do it. It's why they do it apparently so poorly. Let me offer a different word instead that is another term of art, but is a little looser. What I think the United States created after World War II, it attempted rather consciously to create what I think of as a confederation. In the sense that you might think of, the Holy Alliance may have been for a brief time a confederation of monarchs who were determined to try to resist, democratizing revolutions or something like that. It was an anti-communist confederation. See, most confederations have a normative center, and they have some kind of common principle that's the basis for it. They're a little more structured than a coalition. So they create some sort of regular ways in which the members of the confederation meet and discuss. But I say confederation, not federation. More in the sense even of the early European, the common market, which was united by a particular purpose. And the Americans tried to create a fairly complex and elaborate confederation with a number of durable institutions for a fairly clear anti-communist purpose. So, for instance, I was very impressed by a work that Roger Lewis here wrote with a co-author. It's an essay entitled, picking up on the old phrase, imperialism of free trade. Roger and his co-author, who'd helped coin that phrase, wrote an essay on the imperialism of decolonization. And if you look at their story, it's a fairly complicated essay. It's actually hard to read because it's analytically dense. It's very lucid. But basically it's arguing that here's the British and French empires, and they have one notion of empire, and the Americans are clashing with that because they're trying to build this anti-communist confederation. They don't use that exact term. And they say, you need to subordinate your imperial interest to the interests of our confederation. And in effect, it's two different visions of global organization on two different normative principles. And ultimately, the Americans do pretty well in coercing decolonization as necessary for effective membership in the anti-communist confederation. So the question then is, what happens to the anti-communist confederation once the communists disintegrate? And there have been a number of efforts to basically resuscitate the confederation on some different basis. And you can see a lot of examples of that in contemporary life. I'm not judging, I'm not sitting here as a judge saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just trying to observe it in a reasonably descriptive way. And the United States actually does not yet have a clear and compelling basis for this confederation. Actually, the most compelling basis it has for it are, number one, a common vision of a certain kind of international political economy, but then the institutional relationships that go with that are poorly developed because that mission and its structural importance has not been well articulated. And then underneath that, there's a sort of little bit of a sense of, well, we need to kind of keep together to deal with rogue states and disorder of various kinds. Balkan disorders, other things that have just kind of come up. And it's in a little bit the momentum of the old confederation staying together partly out of habit and partly because of institutional routines adapting to the serendipity of new events. You're concerned about that because you don't, I think, find that a very durable basis for a future confederation, and you may think that a confederation is probably a more effective way for the European states and the United States to concert their efforts. I might agree with you, but as a historian, it's not really appropriate for me to make a political argument.
Hold on, Jim.
Your argument, in essence, sort of replacing the old Williams, Lefebvre, I mean, you go on, model of American foreign policy in the mid-20th centuries, the anti-communist confederation. What's the purpose then? If it's anti-communism in the interest of what? Because there must have been some model, which obviously Williams would then talk about capitalism. He would talk about the flow of capital, the flow of commodities, that for him that would be the purpose of the anti-communist confederation, and that would be the larger principle, the axiom in a sense. So what would you, if you reduce it to the anti-communist confederation, you're missing the larger purpose.
Yeah, it's, in my view, it's actually it's relatively simple. Frankly, if you need me to answer the question, it's not the right answer. Why do I say that? Because this is an axiom that 100 million Americans understood. If I'm the only person who can recall it, then I've recalled it incorrectly. It's actually, if you kind of went out on the street and asked someone, why are we building up this army about the communists? They'd kind of give you some sort of rough and ready answer to that. It's just, well, it would have something to do, they might use words like dictatorship, appeasement, tyranny, don't want another World War II. And actually, if you then kind of wrote that down and then tried to lay out the catechism that it reflected and the axiomatic beliefs embedded in it, I believe you could write this out with a high degree of predictability from one Rotary Club to the next. And it was extremely powerful because so many people understood it. Now, why did so many people understood it? Actually, Mel Leffler is here. He does a service in his book, The Specter of Communism, pointing out, which several other people have done. Anti-communism is a tremendous social movement in the United States. I actually think that anti-communism is one of the most important cultural movements in the United States in the 20th century. Its way antedates World War II. It's provoked by a lot of different things, including kind of some cultural shocks that resonated especially in certain ethnic and religious communities. And if you read the kind of the history of American anti-communism, it's just clear that this is a set of ideas that had penetrated deeply into American communities long before Harry Truman became president. So then what happens is a lot of those pre-existing sentiments are activated in a very particular way around an international environment in combination with appeasement, danger of global tyranny, and that whole set of things. And that amounted to the kind of the guiding principles of the anti-communist confederation, the axiomatic beliefs and the institutions that grew up around that, which I think were actually decisively framed during the 1950s. I think 80% of the DNA of the United States government, even today, is shaped between, certainly 1940 to 1960, and actually I think probably the large majority of that between 1950 and 1960.
Philip, we're running out of time. I wonder whether we could collect some questions and let you address them.
Go ahead, Red. We'll take a... Yep. Look for the microphone. Microphone, Red.
If you all will forgive a simple man's question, it seems to me that the United States views itself, and indeed is, in politics and otherwise, a so-called Christian country, and that its definition of democracy, representative government, is so closely allied to, overlain by, the idea that democracy is a Christian doctrine has led us astray for years in proposing economics, political reform, and so forth and so on around the world. And because Christianity is seen to be, in, I think, the American opinion, I mean, what can be a higher calling than Christ incarnate? And therefore, this is an especially important view for the United States to use when talking with others. Our man up here is better than yours, and it's more closely allied with the way that we think you and we and everybody ought to live, that it has an extra special character and can't be discussed successfully entirely in some of your categories, although I loved your speech.
All right, thank you. Well, it's Frederick Bouzot.
Thank you. Just one brief question. In order for axiomatic beliefs to become big P policies, if I understand you correctly, you need a reaction, you need public opinion adherence, and I submit you also need power. You need national power. What happens when that national power diminishes or vanishes? Will there be big policies in the future?
Thank you. And is there a final question over here? If not, then we'll go take one more question, and then we'll close the list.
Hi, Michael Pillsbury from Andy Marshall's Office of Net Assessment. I'm just curious to what degree your in earnest framework is unique to America or could be applied to other countries. We have a study underway now of Chinese axioms. When China has had a kind of consensus breakdown in the leadership, and then not public opinion in our sense, but debates take place, the Chinese themselves acknowledge a series of these, not exactly, I'm sure not your 10 cases, but they have cases like that themselves. And we found that there are a few people who studied the Soviet Union in the same way. Nathan Leites had a series of axioms he drew. So are you going to limit yourself to just the United States in this framework, or is there a little bit of political science spirit in your soul still?
Thank you. All right.
I take the point about the significance of Christian belief in the American definition of democracy, and I regard religious beliefs as a pervasive part of the distinctively American scheme that I was portraying. I think on the issue of national power and what do we do if it declines, I actually think axiomatic beliefs do arise in any case. Actually, Americans, one of the peculiar things about the early American period are these very interesting arguments about the character of their national power. Remember, Jefferson has embarked on this unbelievable experiment. He says, I'm going to lead a very powerful country that will forswear large armed forces. We're going to be powerful without an army in a hostile and dangerous world. And then you work through, like, how did he think he would do that? Well, actually, and it's a very elaborate argument. It's he thought that, and the reason he didn't want the army was not because he was a pacifist. He thought that it was the road to tyranny. This is the whole viewpoint on having rejected the fiscal military state that Britain had created, that he thought was being recreated in the United States and was being advocated by monocrats like Alexander Hamilton. So, in other words, there's a deliberate effort to keep America weak, because that's the way it will keep its institutions strong. Yet then he has to develop a series of arguments about that he hopes will become popular, about how weakness is a good thing. He was incredibly successful. I mean, America basically hewed to the notion that it should not have a significant army right up to 1940, 70 years after it had the largest economy in the world, which is, if you think from a world history point of view, I don't know of any analogy to it. So what if national power declines? The cycles will still work, but in different ways. Michael Pillsbury's question about China is extremely interesting. I actually imbibed, when I was a young Cold Warrior many years ago, Nathan Leite's operational code of the Politburo, and mused about these things. And I'm not writing on the Chinese case. I can barely think I can comprehend the American one, and I look to China experts like you to educate me about China. I read this material attentively, and I'll be going to China in about a week or so to try to learn a little bit more, sitting at the knees of the folks at the Central Party School. But here's the point I'd make about the Chinese, just from very superficial observations from time to time over the years, is everything I've said applies to China much more intensively. Why? Because they're incredibly self-conscious about the promulgation of axioms, much more so than we are. Now, their political system is, in the climate in which these axioms are developed, is very, very different. It's distinctive in quite other ways. But so you see over and over again in Chinese history, the 4 no's, the 5 this, the 6 that, all kind of into a mnemonic, so that the axioms that the leadership has adopted on any given principle can readily be memorized by 300 million people. Well, that is the pretty clear example of the express cultivation of axiomatic beliefs to the point they can be recited by rote if you're woken up out of a deep sleep. And so therefore the study of what kind of beliefs that their leadership cultivates is of extreme interest, as in part just because of the mental map it reveals about the leadership. What would be very interesting to me is also if I saw that the leadership was not doing that on some important subject. The absence of a prescribed axiom on some important matter being discussed publicly in China would intrigue me, because then that would indicate to me either A, the leadership is moving to a different model of political culture, or B, it is confused and divided about what to say.
Thank you. I think we all owe Professor Zelikow a thanks for a fascinating, stimulating hour and a half. I'd like to invite all of you out to reception, but let's give a round of applause to Philip.